Y ahora voy a ceder la palabra a Tom McDonough, que va a ser el keynote speaker, con una ponencia magistral titulada Filmando lo cotidiano, París, 1960. No voy a leer la biografía de Tom McDonough porque está impresa en el programa y creo que el tiempo apremia y es importante oír lo que tiene Tom. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Gabriela. I suppose I should begin, indeed, by thanking the organizers of SITAC, and in particular Gabriela Rangel, for the opportunity to come here and share work with you this afternoon. And also to thank two less visible forces, our translators, who will allow you to understand this arcane talk, and also our AV people as well, who have made sure that you have something to look at. But I'm sorry, I'm not going to show you Marina Abramovic's crotch anymore, so can we maybe move on to the first one? It's just that kind of afternoon, I'm sorry. But indeed, indeed. Today I do want to talk with you about two films in particular. I guess it's a conference on contemporary art and theory, but as a historian as well as a critic, I think it's useful perhaps to begin with an historical perspective and to move back to what I think is a really crucial point of origin for thinking about a particular kind of blindness, I suppose. The blindness inscribed within everyday life itself. And I want to think about the problematic precisely of bringing the everyday to the realm of visibility, into the realm of representation. And I want to think about that through two films made in the early 1960s in Paris, two experimental documentaries, one known as Chronicle of a Summer and the other called Critique of Separation. So I'll begin. I want to begin with a small notice that appeared in the arts and theater section of the Parisian daily newspaper Le Monde on Thursday, October 19th, 1961. It was a notice that announced the opening of a new film, Chronique d'un été, Chronicle of a Summer. And it read, Jean Rouch, author of Moi Noir and Pyramide Humaine, and Edgar Morin have tried an experiment in cinéma vérité with some Parisians who talk without pretense about their professional and private life. This film won the Critics' Award at the last Cannes Festival. It's a very laconic little notice. But behind it lay one of the most widely discussed and influential documentary films of the decade. Can I get the next image? Ethnologist Jean Rouch, who had gained a significant reputation over the previous decade for his ever more ambitious films of African life, including the aforementioned Me, a Black Man of 1957, you see a still from that up on the screen now, and Human Pyramid of 1959, Rouch joined sociologist Edgar Morin to produce a study of what he called this strange tribe living in Paris, turning the ethnographic gaze back upon the metropole at the moment of decolonization. Filmgoers would have seen images shot on the boulevards of Paris, not so different from the neighborhood where they were now sitting in the movie theater, right? Images of other Parisians, like themselves, stopped on the street and asked a curiously inchoate question. Tell us, are you happy? Can I have the next image? Chronique d'un été was a film then whose subject was everyday life itself, that rather unformed, amorphous daily existence, and its imbrication with, or disjunction from, the broader world and the forces of history. And as such, it was by no means unique. At the same moment that Chronique was being filmed in Paris, Guy Debord was shooting his short film, Critique de la Séparation, Critique of Separation, a project that he described as an experimental documentary. And you see our two main characters up on the screen now, Rouch on the left and the young, dashing Guy Debord on the right. Debord, too, was concerned with investigating everyday life at the ambiguous opening of this new decade. And his film also, at least implicitly, revolved around the question insistently posed in Rouch and Morin's documentary, are you happy? But the meaning of this question, and how it ultimately might be answered, differed profoundly from one film to the next. Here, in close proximity the one with the other, we find two radically differing conceptions of the documentary form, of the possibilities for open dialogue and communication between its subjects, and finally, of everyday life itself. Now, this conjunction of concerns was by no means coincidental. Debour's film was undoubtedly, among other things, a response to Chronique d'une été. And I mean, I could go into a lot of boring historical detail because I'm an obsessive, boring historian, but I'll spare you it and simply say that Rouche and Morin had hoped to invite a very close friend and colleague of Guy Debord to be in their film. But this was, of course, the Parisian intelligentsia circa 1960, filled with conflict and argument and irrational hatreds, so that wouldn't be allowed, and so there was all these kinds of refusals to have this person in Rouche and Morin's film. But essentially, the important thing to recognize is that Debourg was well aware of this documentary project while it was being made from a very early stage, had very direct awareness of it. It was a small world. Paris, 1960. So there are these fugitive connections that we can trace out between these films. And depending on your obsessiveness, they may be more or less interesting, but in any case, they're really not at the heart of my subject here today. My claim isn't merely that Debourg knew of Chronique d'une été, but that his experimental documentary can in fact only be understood if we see it as a refutation of this other film and of the entire project of which it was a part. As, that is, a radically different vision of documentary and a radically different analysis of the everyday life of the French. Now, the idea of a new documentary form, an experimental documentary, was much in the air at the time, not least thanks to the publication in January 1960 of an article by Morin, one of the directors of Chronicle of a Summer. He publishes an article at the beginning of 1960 called For a New Cinéma Vérité. And in it, the sociologist called for a documentary cinema that would capture what he describes as the authenticity of life as it's lived, or the depth of everyday life as it's really lived. I mean, this marks a break for him from the normal task of documentary in the past, where documentary had ceded these realms to the more sensitive explorations of fictional film, contenting itself instead with the examination of the individual's milieu, his or her external relations with industrial or agricultural labor, the role of modern technology, mass experience, essentially. But now Morin demanded that documentary, as he writes, reinterrogate man by means of cinema, via the integration of an ethnographic model of participant observation. The filmmaker united in the closest possible contact with his or her subjects. His exemplar of this new cinéma vérité was Rouche, who, as he says, equipped only with a 16mm camera and a tape recorder slung across his shoulders, had abandoned the heavy appurtenances of the film director and could immerse himself in a given community like, Morin writes, like a scuba diver exploring some exotic undersea world. It only remained for future explorers to turn this ethnographic eye from African society to the contemporary West, to workers, the petite bourgeoisie, the petty bureaucrats, the men and women of our enormous cities. What was the aim of this new documentary that wished, as Morin wrote, to penetrate beyond appearances, beyond defenses, to enter the unknown world of everyday life? Nothing less than the abolition of separation. Breaking the membrane, Morin writes, breaking the membrane that isolates each of us from others in the metro, on the street, or on the stairway of the apartment building. Documentary would become what he called a cinema of brotherhood. Can I get the next image? Chronique d'une été was meant to be the realization of this manifesto, what Morin called a sociological fresco of Paris during the summer of 1960. When the Algerian War was believed to be in its final chapter, right? France had been waging a long-standing war against the independence of its North African département, Algeria, right? And so we see repeatedly in the film these images of contemporary newspapers and the like that are always trumpeting headlines from Algeria and other struggles. Of course, the Algerian War would not end in the summer of 1960. It would drag on another 2 years before Algeria won its independence. But for its creators, Chronicle of a Summer began with a desire to elucidate the unexplored depths of private life, of which Morin had spoken in his Cinéma Vérité essay. Can I get the next? They would inquire after not only the sociological bases of the private sphere, housing, work, leisure, but also its existential profundities, the style of life, the attitude people have toward themselves and toward others, their means of conceiving their most profound problems and the solutions to those problems, as Morin later described it. The echoes between this program and that of Henri Lefebvre, the greatest theorist of everyday life as a philosophical category, and Morin's close colleague, are unmistakable. What they both shared, Morin and Lefebvre, was an awareness of the very obscurity of the subject in question. When Lefebvre had returned to write the lengthy foreword to the second edition of his Critique of Everyday Life in 1958, he was compelled to confess a certain obscurity in the very concept. Where is it to be found? Where is everyday life to be found, he asks. And he responds, in work or in leisure? In family life and moments lived outside of culture? Initially, the answer seems obvious. Everyday life, he says, involves all three elements, all three aspects. It is their unity and their totality, and it determines the concrete individual. And yet, this answer is not entirely satisfactory. Indeed, Lefebvre's recognition that for the historian of a specific period, for the ethnographer, for the sociologist studying a society or a group, the fundamental question would be to grasp a certain quality difficult to define and yet essential and concrete. That recognition on the part of Lefebvre could well stand as the coda to Chronicle of a Summer, this film made precisely through the collaboration of a sociologist and an ethnographer. Can I get the next image? Rouche and Morin would evolve certain procedures in order to penetrate that obscurity and access the difficult-to-define quality of everyday life. Notably, they sought what they called psychoanalytic stimulants. Not what you're thinking, not like we have today. Unfortunately, it was a more basic time. They sought psychoanalytic stimulants that might enable participants to talk about subjects they would normally be unwilling or unable to discuss. Morin had already broached this question in his 1960 essay, in which he wrote of participants in this new documentary form playing out their lives before the filmmaker in a game that, as he writes, has the value of psychoanalytic truth. That is to say, precisely that which is hidden or repressed comes to the surface in these roles. In Chronicle, both he and Rouche were avowed participants, provocateurs really, challenging their subjects with questions, hoping to precipitate a crisis, sometimes with startling success. We see them here on a boulevard, that's Morin hounding someone with questions. The camera acted as a catalyst, right? What they called an accelerator, provoking its subjects to reveal themselves under circumstances that, while entirely artificial, were supposed to have the paradoxical effect of bringing hidden truths to the surface. Even contemporary viewers recognized the innovative quality of this approach. Le Monde's film critic noted how the central figures in Chronicle managed thereby to tackle some of the key problems of our time. Can I get the next? He goes on, disgust with an occupational universe that's become inhuman, and nostalgia for a job you could take an interest in, obsessive fear in the Jewish woman of certain memories, difficulty in accepting a complete sexual freedom, temptation towards a kind of peace of mind without responsibility or rebellion on the part of a student in the film, a casual difficulté d'être, fear of loneliness, a confused wish for love and brotherhood. Such, the film critic wrote, are the main themes that can be drawn from this succession of spontaneous confessions. In the intervening decades, this inscription of the camera into the film text has become banal, if not sinister. But at the time of Chronicle's release in 1961, it was nothing short of astonishing. I mean, the same reviewer in Le Monde spoke repeatedly of what he called the shamelessness of the film and its subjects, precisely for the kind of emotional nakedness, I think, that contemporaries detected there. And the film really appeared to offer an unprecedented window into the otherwise opaque daily lives of those filmed. The camera became a sort of surrogate analyst or father confessor, coaxing and sometimes forcing a discourse of truth from its subjects, a technology of vision become a technology of self. Can I get the next image? Defenders of Rouche's work have often returned to this conception of the camera as provocateur, as an assertive presence in the filmic event whose role was stressed and which in fact ceased to be a mere technical obstacle, as was thought to be in most ethnographic filmmaking, which had attempted to hide the work of the camera and the microphone. And instead, the camera became the primary pretext for the subject's revelation of self. You see it kind of looming over the table there on the upper left-hand corner in this production shot from Chronicle of a Summer. But the status of the technological apparatus in Rouche's film is notably unstable. One of the great myths that grew around Chronicle of a Summer was that of its experimentation with new camera technology. Shooting had begun with Raoul Coutard behind the camera. You all know Raoul Coutard. He was Godard's cameraman for Au bout de souffle, for Breathless of 1959, and numerous subsequent films of Godard's. I mean, Godard's classic Nouvelle Vague films were all filmed by Raoul Coutard. He began work with Rouche and Morin on Chronicle of a Summer, using a standard Arriflex. But when even this relatively portable 16mm camera proved too bulky, Rouche brought in the Québécois documentarist Michel Brault, who had extensive experience with handheld camera technology. With the help of a technician at the Éclair camera factory, they were able to use an experimental piece of equipment that was light, silent, highly portable, and outfitted with sync sound. It was essentially a prototype of the famous KMT Couton Marteau Éclair. Yes, as you all know. This camera, this experimental camera, allowed the film crew to operate freely on the streets of Paris, to move about while filming and capture its subjects in the midst of their daily activities. It was the technological basis of this new cinéma vérité. But this technology, this camera work, had a paradoxical effect. If the visible presence of the camera had a provocative effect on participants in the film, it was also, at the same time, curiously invisible, a kind of blind spot inscribed at the very heart of this production. Miniaturization, portability, and the like were a means of hiding the work of the camera and microphone, of seeming to restitute the lived in a raw manner, and eliminating any intervention of the filmmaker and his technique. We are subject to what has been called a natural language of cinema, in which film is figured as a duplicate, a simple mirror of a pro-filmic reality. This entailed precisely a repression of the work of signification in favor of the preservation of the homogeneous nature of reality, which can be easily and unproblematically rendered visible. Chronicle of a Summer, then, occupied an uneasy ground between this conception of film as evidence and a recognition of film as text, as, in other words, a semiotic activity that produced and did not merely reflect meaning. The next image. Something of Rouche's ambivalence can be sensed in his attitude toward Dziga Vertov. The term cinéma vérité was itself an homage to the Soviet filmmaker, a translation of his term kino pravda, film truth. And discussions of Chronicle often reference Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera of 1929 and its reflexive documentary practice as a precedent for the later film. But the alignment of these practices cannot hold. At the most basic level, Vertov's practice had depended crucially on experiments with montage, while Rouche's valorization of the direct transcription of reality could only conceive of montage as a formalist distortion, a dead end. Indeed, Rouche's version of Vertov renaturalized his kino eye, the mechanized eye of the camera, as a sort of synthesis of the human eye and its technological prosthesis that produced a greater humanity as well as a greater objectivity. Rather than a tool in ideological struggle, in which montage was the site of a contestation of meaning, the camera was thought of as an innocent, neutral instrument a mirror and also a window open to the outside, as Rouche once remarked. An instrument that was in fact the site of production of the most spontaneous ideology, that of a metaphysics of reality. But I guess I want to move along to ask just what was this reality that Rouche and Morin set out to explore with the help of their novel documentary techniques, their noiseless mobile cameras, and convivial interview style. Perhaps the question is best answered by saying that they conceived reality in essentially Freudian terms. We'll recall that Freud had presupposed the existence of two real and unknown worlds, one exterior and the other psychic or interior, right? And that, relying upon Kant, Freud had rejoiced at the conclusion that, of the two, only interior reality stood a chance of being understood. Even if Freud, at the end of his life, would arrive at a rather different conception of this partition of interior and exterior, whereby the psychic apparatus extended into space, and space in its turn was the projection of this apparatus, his work, and that of his followers, remained encumbered by this ineradicable intuition that psychic life was an inside delimited by a surface, the skin, which was turned toward exterior reality. Rouche and Morin would adopt an identical perspective, in that Chronicle of a Summer superimposed the topography of the Freudian unconscious on that of the Lefebvrean everyday. Like analysts before their patient, they hoped, actually, can we get the next image? Like analysts before their patient, they hoped to coax out the mysteries of this peculiarly social unconscious, the lived experience of Parisians circa 1960. And in fact, the difficulties encountered in this project seem to stem from the fact that in order to grasp this fundamentally elusive unconscious, one needed a device that, while external to it, was simultaneously dependent upon and responsive to the conditions of that very internal realm. For Freud, this had, of course, been the psychoanalytic experience itself. For the filmmakers, however, it was the technique of cinéma vérité, with its various stimulants to revelation. Here, in their interviewing methods, as in the analytic relation, the two apparently separate worlds interpenetrated in the crossed form of a chiasma, joining the subject's desire to that of Rouche and Morin themselves. The border between these two realms, interior and exterior, that border is so large that it absorbs the two worlds that it separates. The film strip marked the frontier of those two worlds. That, on the one hand, of the supposedly neutral scientific researchers behind the camera, and that, on the other hand, of their subjects, loci of everydayness, who are filmed. But as in the analytic experience, that clear topography of interior-exterior was continually troubled by Rouche and Morin's filmic dispositif, by their need to precisely break down the boundaries separating investigator from object. Indeed, the techniques they pioneered in Chronicle of a Summer unavoidably constructed a film strip/border broad enough to encompass both the worlds that the camera had of necessity to separate. But cinéma vérité both summoned forth that confusion, that mutual desire of analyst and analysand, and simultaneously disavowed it. Chronicle of a Summer symptomatically concluded with a scene of the two filmmakers, Rouche and Morin, walking through the Musée de l'Homme and discussing the outcome of the project, reinscribing its author's status as dispassionate observers and a stable topography of the division of worlds. But to this duality of Freudian realities, we might counterpose a Lacanian topology, let's say, that brings into play rather more precise relations. As one famous Lacanian commentator has written, in place of two realities, it is a question of one alone, uniform and without partition. And it is this psychoanalytic reality that topology tries to take into account. So, Freud's conception of a clash and interference between two worlds and their respective languages is abandoned in this Lacanian model, right? That which replaces it is suggested in Lacan's extension and alteration of Plato's allegory of the cave. Lacan writes, "The place in question is the entrance to the cave, towards the exit of which Plato guides us, while one imagines seeing the psychoanalyst entering there." So the philosopher is leaving, but the psychoanalyst is entering the cave, right? But things are not that easy. As it is an entrance one can only reach just as it closes. The place will never be popular with tourists, Lacan writes in a cheeky aside. And the only way for it to open up a bit is by calling from the inside. In other words, it's always closing time at the cave of the unconscious. And the only way of gaining access is to be inside already. In contrast to the clear borderline dividing interior from exterior in Freudian topography, Lacanian topology proposes a cave mouth that more closely resembles a Moebius strip, which has only one side and one surface. Interior and exterior no longer evoke heterogeneous surfaces. Rather, the opposition between these two worlds has become internal to the circular structure of the topological object itself. Any analysis of the unconscious/everyday must position itself both within and outside this cave, eschewing the simplifying fictions of inclusion and exclusion that govern an earlier Freudian topography. To pursue Lacan's analogy, the representation of the everyday occurs precisely at the mouth of the cave, at which the philosopher/revolutionary attempting to escape meets the psychoanalyst entreating entry. The mouth of the cave, characterized by its rapid opening and shutting, Lacan describes how what we have to account for is the gap, beat, or alternating suction of the opening and closing of the cave entrance. That mouth of the cave becomes the projector and screen onto which the everyday, the unconscious of official histories, enters into visibility, even as it continually resists formalization. This would be a cinematic topology of the everyday, one that insisted on its own imbrication within the social and psychic structures it set out to represent, as against cinéma vérité's metaphysical claim of a disinterested observation, premised on a belief in the evidential power of film. Okay, the next image, please. Now, Guy Debord's critique of separation opened with a trailer for itself that can only be characterized as a parody of this cinematic language, of the cinematic language of Rouche and Morin. After images of a still photograph of a girl wearing a bikini, a text frame that reads, "coming soon to this screen," and a very brief glimpse of newsreel footage of a riot in the Belgian Congo, we are given a rather long traveling shot, which you see here up on the screen, apparently filmed out the window of an automobile as it travels down the Boulevard Saint-Michel, past the Musée de Cluny and the intersection with the Boulevard Saint-Germain. So we're right in the heart of the Latin Quarter in Paris's left bank. Debord's cinematographer, Andrei Mrogalski, here made use of camera work that directly recalled that of Raoul Coutard in Godard's Breathless, and of course in Chronicle of a Summer. And in this sequence, one can in fact distinctly make out on the eastern side of the boulevard, you see it here in this frame, on the eastern side of the boulevard an awning with the name Raoul printed in large letters. Surely a coincidence, but still a remarkable index of its intended cinematographic target. Exactly coinciding with this sequence, so as these images are up on the screen, was a voiceover by a woman of the following text, the opening sentence of a book on general linguistics just published in France at that time. The sentence reads, "If we reflect how natural and advantageous it is for man to identify his language with reality, we shall appreciate how high a degree of sophistication has to be reached before he could dissociate them and make of each a separate object of study." The same voice went on to narrate the credits for the film, which she described as a documentary, while a text frame exclaimed real characters, an authentic story, before the screen returned to another short segment from the Congo newsreel. This brief introductory sequence to Debord's film was nothing if not a highly condensed critique of the premises of cinéma vérité, with all its pretensions to spontaneity, rawness, instinctiveness, sincerity, and also a critique of any assumption of film as a natural language with a privileged indexical relation to reality. The Martinet quote was deployed as an epigraph precisely to indicate the critical relation to be developed here between the film text and pro-filmic reality. Each would become an object of study in this film, in which any notion of the real or authentic would be thrown into radical doubt through, above all else, the volatilization of the meaning of images and text in its use of montage. Can I get the next image, please? If Rouch and Morin had assumed a sort of transparency of image, a sort of transparency between their cinematic language and reality, their film was underpinned to an even greater degree by the status accorded spoken language, which became the guarantor of truth in Chronicle of a Summer. You see here a famous scene, the two directors seated around a table enjoying this convivial dinner with the participants where, after lots of wine being consumed and the like, they're getting everyone to open up and talk about their lives. Indeed, advances in sync sound technology had allowed the film to be about nothing more than people talking. Yet what struck contemporary viewers was less the dialogue so much desired by the film's two directors, less, that is, the moments in which communication might serve, as Martinet put it, to establish contact, to allow people to enter into relations with one another, than those points at which communication broke down and gave way to incomprehension and inexpressibility in what one reviewer called certain gestures, certain tics, certain stammerings, and above all, certain silences. Can you get the next image, please? This same reviewer remarked that silences play a large role in Chronicle of a Summer. We see it when one of the characters and one of the figures in the film, a Jewish woman who's a survivor of a concentration camp, explains to two exchange students from Africa what the tattoo on her arm means, right? Or can I get the next image, please? A young Italian secretary living in Paris who's kind of driven to the brink of hysteria, as the film reviewer describes it. These kind of overwhelming silences that mark the film. It was just these moments of confusion, however, the groping formulations, awkwardnesses, and silences of many of the participants in Chronicle of a Summer, that functioned to anchor the film all the more tenaciously in an objective reality, and that attested to its spontaneous, unmediated relation to the truth. You know, for stammering and uncertainty in this film always operated as a prelude to enlightenment, to the arrival at knowledge. You know, stammering, the inability to speak, was always a spur to further talk on the subject's part in an ongoing quest for an objective view. Now, Critique of Separation, Deboer's film, however, went further, placing in doubt the authority of its own subject of enunciation, the directorial commentary provided over the image track by the voice of Deboer himself. He in fact Deboer opens his film with a confession of his own confusion. One of the first line that he speaks in the voiceover, we hear him say, "We don't know what to say." An uncertainty that threatened to leave one mute, and that hung, as it were, over the entire film. This sentiment would be reiterated, the film compared with a blurry, drunken vision. At another point, Deboer admitted on his voiceover that none of this is very clear. It's a completely typical drunken monologue, I feel like this talk, with its incomprehensible allusions and its tiresome delivery, with its vain phrases that do not await response, and its sententious explanations, and its silences. This is a segment of Deboer's voiceover. A subtitle in the closing moments seemed to capture the exasperation of the viewer subjected to this drunkard's rant. I didn't understand all of it. Drunkenness, physical fatigue, the inability to find the right word, all were moments in which the communicative role of language broke down, as Martinet had pointed out in his book on linguistics. Yet this incomprehension and the silences of critique differed fundamentally from those of the participants in Chronicle of a Summer. If in the latter they had served as evidence for the subject's willing display of what they felt, of a kind of emotional truth that appeared unconcerned with the reactions of the film's viewers, the structure of Debord's film seemed to purposely foster this sense of bewilderment. Can I get the next image, please? A simultaneous use of images, voiceover narration, and subtitling throughout the film made it particularly difficult to follow, made any straightforward understanding elusive. And this was hardly inadvertent on Debord's part. Such a refusal of transparency has been described by film historian Tom Levine as part of a double-edged mimesis of incoherence, the deliberate staging of confusion as both a refusal of a false and reductive pseudo-coherence of narrative spectacle, and as a reflection of the fundamental incoherence of the reality of late capitalism. Or, as Debord stated within the film itself, the poverty of means is charged with expressing plainly the scandalous poverty of the subject. Make the next image, please. But we can make Levine's invaluable analysis more precise. For Debord's subject was not so much the incoherent reality of late capitalism as a whole, but rather, like Chronicle of a Summer, that of everyday life under such conditions. Critique was a film structured around all that clandestinity of private life, regarding which we possess nothing but pitiful documents, as Debord says. His language here was significant. If Rouche and Morin, as ethnographers of the contemporary urbanized West, sought to penetrate the depths of everyday life, to bring light to its mysterious abyssal foundations, Debord would insist on the contrary, on its very impenetrability, on its resistance to representation. Critique opened precisely on a private note, with a tracking shot, which you see a glimpse of here, of Debord sitting with a group of people at a left bank cafe, the camera zooming in to focus on the director himself, in deep conversation with an attractive young woman, with whom he walks off. That woman is played by, can we get the next image? We see Debord walking off with her. That's Caroline Rittener in what would appear her unique cinematic performance. And she's the same person who provides the voiceover for the trailer sequence that I spoke of earlier. This young woman appears throughout Critique of Separation as a representation of a kind of lost object of desire, as an emblem of the failed attempt at a more intense life that has not really been found. Can I get the next image, please? And as such, she played a major role in the film's thematics of loss and exhaustion, of the very impossibility of communication. That impossibility was indelibly linked with this specific experience of libidinal frustration. Debord says in the film, this incomprehension is ubiquitous in everyday encounters. Something must be stated precisely, but time is lacking and we are not sure of having been understood. Before we have done or said what was necessary, we've already gone away. We've crossed the street. We've gone overseas. We can't go back. So, can I get the next image, please? In both films under examination here, private life continually bled into a broader investigation of the socio-political conditions within which it was lived. Morin and Rouche's interview subjects, for example, as you can see here, they broach increasingly broad questions regarding the contemporary political situation abroad, in particular the colonial wars in Algeria and the Congo, and the blocked perspectives for transformation within France itself. Despair, solitude, and boredom appeared as the dominant themes of many of the discussions recorded by the two directors. The result was a certain confusion, evident not only in the breakdowns of dialogue on camera, but also in the very conception of the project on the part of its makers, who seemed torn between creating a neutral ethnographic document about what they called mankind, and alternately outlining a set of social positions from which a new left might be articulated. Can I get to the next image? Hence, we find a very young Régis Debray, pre-Argentina and things like that, or pre-Bolivia, rather. Here being interviewed by Edgar Morin. But whereas in Chronique, those socio-political conditions appeared haphazardly, as it were, as disruptions of the director's original plans for the film that were in fact often the subject of resistance. In Debord's Critique, they were staged with deliberate intent as a means to precisely call into question the typical coherence of the documentary form, its didactic certainty and its search for comprehension. Just after the film's opening cafe sequence, Debord's voice intoned over a slow 360-degree panoramic survey of the cityscape surrounding the terrain vague of the Plateau Saint-Merry. That's the present-day site of the Beaubourg. At that time, it was just a big parking lot. Debord says, "The cinematic spectacle has its rules that allow one to arrive at satisfactory products. However, the reality from which one must start is dissatisfaction. The function of cinema is to present an isolated false coherence, whether dramatic or documentary, as a substitute for an absent communication and activity. To demystify documentary cinema, it is necessary to dissolve what is called its subject. Il faut dissoudre ce que l'on appelle son sujet." Debord played on the double meaning of the term subject, suggesting the need to break up both the carefully circumscribed subject matter of the typical documentary film, as well as its existential guarantor, the coherent ego of its author. So on one hand, the rhythm of a documentary on private life would continually be interrupted by what seemingly lay at its very horizon, the public struggles occurring in places like the Congo and Algeria, to the point where its ostensible subject was revealed to be just one aspect of a broader condition. Can I get the next image, please? Namely, the imposition of a spectacular distance or separation between individuals and their ability to actively mold the life world, whether on the personal or collective plane. If Chronicle of a Summer could also be said to have similarly, if inadvertently, exploded the documentary form, critique would go further, and also, as we have seen, call into question the production of an authorial ego itself, to which both Rouche and Morin tenaciously clung as the sole foundation for coherence and unity remaining in their film. And I'll remind you that Chronique symptomatically concluded with a scene of the two filmmakers walking through the Musée de l'Homme and discussing the outcome of the project. It was no coincidence that the panoramic view of the Plateau Saint-Merry discussed above was accompanied by subtitles that quoted the opening lines of Dante's Inferno. "Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark for the straightforward path of camaraderie, all in the hope of making each person's reality emerge, in search of a flash of the truth which is hidden within us beneath our petrified relationships," as Morin had it. The techniques of cinéma vérité constituted an elaborate means by which representation could be conjured away, replaced by a fantasy of immediacy and reciprocity, and the camera became a tool, akin to the psychoanalyst's couch, for fostering communication. Debord's critique sought, in contrast, to utilize the cinema reflexively as a means of analyzing the limitations of communication, both in social relations at large and within the medium itself. The film became, inevitably, an instance of the situation it endeavored to study. His experimental documentary held at a goal at the very opposite to that of Rouche and Morin's search for what they called commensality. As one read in a subtitle within the film, it was part of a global attempt to disturb everywhere the machinery of the existing false dialogue. The Debordian strategy of the mimesis of incoherence found an echo in other critical reflections on culture under the conditions of advanced capitalism. Lucien Goldman, a famous French cultural critic, when asked by Raymond Balleur to respond to Chronicle of a Summer for a special for a film journal, commented on the social limits of artistic coherence. Goldman said, "Truth, realism, coherence, and aesthetic unity are values whose attainment is not these days a simple problem of good faith, effort, talent, or even individual genius. It is also, in the first instance, the problem of the difficulties and limits which a cultural milieu brings to bear on the products of the mind." The question then became not the greater or lesser attainment of such classical values of the artwork, but the degree of reflexiveness or self-consciousness with which one dealt with the inevitable failure of artistic communication today, with what Goldman characterized as the inherent difficulties of both sociological research and aesthetic creation in contemporary industrial society. And here we may insist on the distinction to be drawn between the approach of Debord and that of Rouche and Morin, for the latter only inadvertently, as it were, admitted these difficulties into their film. which strained, as we've seen, to preserve its internal logic against the centrifugal tendencies of its subject matter, while the former, De Boer's film, situated them at the very heart of its project, to the extent that they become the very subject of this curious anti-documentary. Once again, the notion of separation was central to this distinction. Can I get the next image? Rouche and Morin had set out to abolish the separation between its participants in the name of immediacy and brotherhood, an undertaking emblematized most forcefully, perhaps, by the scene in which Angelo, a factory worker, spoke with Landry, a student from West Africa, and deployed a naturalized language of cinematic realism in order to erase the marks of meaning production. De Boer, however, operated with an altogether more intractable paradox, that a critique of separation in contemporary society required an analysis that insisted on separation, of viewer from film, of film from pro-filmic reality. This insistence on separation was evident even in the matter of cinematic technique, in the emphasis De Boer would place on the formalist techniques of editing that Rouche had long spurned. I mean that separation here implied montage, what the situationists termed détournement, to underline the acts of cultural theft it entailed. Montage not merely as a kind of physical cutting, but also as a method of distanciation and by implication of mediation. Again, Goldman's comments on Chronicle of a Summer seem apposite here. Can I get the next image? In questioning its use of unguided or barely directed interviews and clinical conversations as means of access to the knowledge of human reality, Goldman noted the major methodological difficulty, which was long since pointed out in the methodological works of Hegel and Marx. He explains, when it's a question of human realities, the truth is never immediate, and anything which is immediate remains abstract, and for that very reason, stained by exactitude, as long as it is not inserted into the whole by a number of more or less large and complex mediations. I mean, at least some of the incoherence of Critique of Separation owed to De Boer's attempt to incorporate just such large and complex mediations into any experiments in the representation of everyday life. Can I get the next image, please? Nevertheless, certainly, the experience of the viewer of De Boer's film was undoubtedly one of confusion, faced with a cinema that consistently refused the normative redundancy of sound and image typically found in Hollywood cinema in favor of radical heterogeneity. Written texts interrupt or are superimposed on images, subtitles are often accompanied by other texts read on the voiceover, and so on, in a frontal attack on the conflation of the iconico-indexical signifiers of the cinema with reality. And we might add that for every subtitle that referenced some clear philosophical critical analysis, another frankly expressed De Boer's own sentiments of incoherence, distance, and loss. I guess to put the matter baldly, if we can align Rouche and Morin's project with the positions laid out by Lefebvre in his Critique of Everyday Life, as I've attempted to do here, I want to align De Boer's project with that of Georg Lukács. By this I don't mean, however, the work of the mature Lukács, the Lukács of history and class consciousness, but the early work, the writer of Soul and Form, and in particular of its famous last essay, The Metaphysics of Tragedy. It was here that he developed the contrast between absolute life, what he called authentic life, and relative life, the concrete life of society, life as lived in an empirical, corrupt, and corrupting world. At its heart, tragedy stemmed precisely from the conflict between these two modes of living, between the desire for personal fulfillment and reified, objective reality. This was the conflict that underlay De Boer's analysis of everyday life circa 1960 in Critique of Separation, between what he called all the empty time, all the lost moments of a meaningless daily existence, and in contrast, an ever-elusive, more intense life, whether it be found in amorous adventure or radical socio-political transformation. The confusion of the film was a perfect mirror of what Lukács had termed the chiaroscuro of the everyday. In a famous passage, Lukács wrote, "Life is an anarchy of light and dark. Nothing is ever completely fulfilled in life, nothing ever quite ends. New, confusing voices always mingle with the chorus of those that have been heard before. Everything flows, everything merges into another thing, and the mixture is uncontrolled and impure. Everything is destroyed, everything is smashed. Nothing ever flowers into real life. To live is to live something through to the end, but life means that nothing is ever fully and completely lived through to the end. Life, Lukács concludes, is the most unreal and unliving of all conceivable existences. I think it's like my cheery note, for my audience in Mexico City today. So, okay, go home now. That's enough. No, sorry. The sentiment, even the tone, are recognizably Debordian and find expression throughout the film. But against this formless, unreal existence, both Lukács and Debord hold out the possibility of a different life, glimpsed in fleeting moments of pure negation. Suddenly, there is a gleam, a lightning that illuminates the banal paths of empirical life we read in Soul and Form, something disturbing and seductive, dangerous and surprising, the accident, the great moment, the miracle, an enrichment and a confusion. Debord spoke of something analogous, dreams in which the repressed of our social unconscious returned, dreams that he described as flashes from the unresolved past, flashes that illuminate moments previously lived in confusion and doubt. They provide a blunt revelation of our unfulfilled needs. So we see that the incommunicable in Debord's film is even more complex than we first suspected. Not only the opacity of a reified everydayness in advanced capitalism, but also the uniqueness, the untranslatability of those moments when the absolute appears in the midst of the empirical world. Lukács, at this early moment of his career, had rejected the romantic vision of a reconciliation of the absolute with life, with the avant-garde project of turning life into poetry, and had insisted on a total rejection of the empirical world in favor of a different life, opposed to and exclusive of ordinary life. And so too, a half-century later, did Debord, who refused Lefebvre's revolutionary romanticism in favor of a more rigorous conception of negation that was a legitimate heir to the work of Lukács. So I'm going to call Critique of Separation a Lukácsian film, and maybe spare you the historical detail on why that might have been possible for Debord to make such a film in 1960, his knowledge of this early Lukács, which he puts to effective and poetic use in Critique of Separation, which we might understand to be an analysis of everyday life from within that life's own parameters. A film, I want to say, that refused to adopt a purely external model of critique. Can I get the next image, please? Rouch and Morin's film had, to some extent, done the same, but only so long as the two filmmakers could be seen at its conclusion, pacing the hallways of the Musée de l'Homme and providing the viewer with some conclusions. Even here, however, incomprehension troubled their desire for closure, as Morin's voice brought the film to a close, remarking, "That's the difficulty of communicating something. We're in the know," or more accurately, we too are implicated. Somehow the very model they had established in order to create dialogue and brotherhood had turned out to thwart that end, and the blind fatality of ordinary life had not been dispelled. Debord had accepted that failure from the start, had acknowledged the impossibility of filming absolute life, the living that, paradoxically, life in the present had rendered impossible. Finally, the point would be not to signify such a life through art, but to produce it, to achieve what no film could, the abolition of separation. And I'm just going to add a very, I promise, brief coda, and I want to travel 7 years forward, from 1961 to 1968. Can I get the next image, please? Rouch himself, I want to end by reminding us, would somewhat reluctantly reach a similar conclusion several years later, reflecting in an interview on his experience as a filmmaker of the events of May 68. He began by imagining the project of Chronicle of a Summer transformed into a species of revolutionary pedagogy. He says in this interview, instead of having a stupid strike, which they had in the labs or in the theaters, they should have been able to occupy a movie theater and every day project rushes of what happened the day before. Then you would have had a cinematic reflection of reality that could have modified this reality, and that it would have broadcast what happened in one place to all of Paris at the moment when this world was in the midst of searching out its way. That's the example. But Rouch immediately recognized the impossibility of this fantasy, of the utter transparency of lived experience and filmic representation. He goes on to say, that was the example, if you like, that made me understand that it wasn't possible to do that, because you would have had to do it day after day, immediately, to take advantage of this information. And you couldn't do it because you were involved in this game, and you can't make a film and be an actor at the same time. It's not possible. Within the metaphysics of cinéma vérité, one indeed could not be both director and actor. Within its topography of inclusion and exclusion, this particular combination was forbidden, or at least it had to be overtly disavowed, regardless of the subterranean intertwining of desires between filmmaker and subject. Debord's practice in Critique of Separation, however, permitted just this, even as it acknowledged the impossibility of the sort of transcendence of representation dreamed of by Rouche in his revolutionary meta-film. Indeed, for Debord, filming at the mouth of Plato's cave was less a matter of figuring a cinematic escape, of dispelling the shadows, than of listening to the speech that comes from within, of listening to the utterances of everyday life. Calling from within, he outlined a topological practice of cinema that might still prove fruitful for our own obscure era. Thank you. Oh, sure. No, I'd be happy to answer questions.
Vamos a dar espacio para que el público haga 5 o 6 preguntas a lo sumo.
Would you translate for me? I didn't bring up my little translator.
Oh.
Well, I'm just saying.
¿Tienen alguna pregunta? I will try.
Okay. Well, it's Guatemala, so you can probably ask it.
In English.
Yes. No.
It was a very interesting presentation. I need to thank you for it. I have 2 questions. One is more or less serious. The other one, I think, is a sideline. I think that the positions you posed are incredibly interesting in terms of tracing probably what I would suggest has to do with the role of this moment in defining the fields around everyday life. And particularly, I think that one question I would like to ask you is, which is the genealogy you will find between this project of communication and transparency and reconciliation in Moran and Deserto? Because I think that to a certain extent, the program can be followed, that program, on Deserto's arguments, and that has a marginal effect in cinema as well, in this milieu, because there was a whole project that had to do with the films in the 70s by Luis Lupone that were trying to do a desertorian questioning of let's call it this way, non-elite subjects. Now, however, I'm slightly uncomfortable with your pairing of that moment in the board and Lukács. I think, on the one hand, I think that that's been said quite a lot of times, that the Lukácsian character of this, of the Situationist project. But because of a very specific issue, and this is my question, and because at the end of the day, it's hard to understand what's Lukács's claim on a non-reified proletarian consciousness and the ability of understanding the processes rather than the phenomenological construct, if it is not, again, a view of transparency. And so somehow I think that, in defense of what I think that was very, very extraordinary of your presentation, which is the apology of the opacity of the board's filmmaking, I feel a little bit concerned about that. Now, I would love to see you elaborating on that issue. The second thing, which in reality has to do with a punch that maybe relates to what Gabriela said at the beginning, his opening remarks, is just this line that you made in your start, when you talk about the irrational passions and conflicts of that moment. On the one hand, I would come to say, I would like to ask, what could be a rational hatred? I mean, how can we pose and make an argument around irrational hatreds? How can I divide rational from irrational hatreds?
Sure.
And I think that this would be just a sideline if it weren't the case that a part of Gabriela's presentation involved a certain call for a certain rational behavior. Thank you.
Sure. Well, okay, these are a number of big issues here, and maybe I'll begin with this question of Debord and Lukács. And I want to say two things. I mean, you're absolutely right that, of course, we've known for quite some time what we could call the Lukácsian inheritance of Debord and the Situationist International. And that's largely through the intermediary of Lukács's history and class consciousness. But I'm actually talking about something slightly different. In fact, the moment I'm talking about, 1961, I mean, okay, now here's where you learn that I'm an incredible academic that gets obsessed with detail. 1960-61, Lukács's history and class consciousness is only just being translated into French for the first time. I'm actually interested in something slightly different. It's in what I'm insisting on is this interest in an earlier Lukács, in a pre-Marxist Lukács of Soul and Form, which is a book published in around 1910, right, or 1913, right before World War I. It's a book that, of course, Lukács disavows later in life, for its bourgeois idealist aesthetics. But what I think is interesting is that Debord doesn't simply, and what I can't explore in this paper, is that Debord does not simply take this model, this Manichaean division of the world into a degraded everyday life and this exalted realm of the event, the miracle. He doesn't simply adopt that dichotomy wholesale. What he does, I think, in 1961 is historicize it and develop a kind of critical model for using it. At the same time he's editing his film Critique of Separation, he publishes an article called Conscious Modifications in Everyday Life or something like that. And it's actually, interestingly, a talk that he gave in a seminar on everyday life run by Henri Lefebvre. And in that, he sets out a kind of historical trajectory for thinking of the degradation of everyday life in the early 1960s. And specifically, he does this by reinventing a notion from Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. He reinvents Trotsky's idea of uneven and combined development, if I can read it. Sorry. That's okay. It's good. If I can be like if I can show my Bolshevik. Oh, come. I feel like I'm being censored. What? I must speak. Trotsky has a bad history here in Mexico City, so you should be careful with when you beat me out like that. That is really rough. I'm just going to say, I can see where I'm heading. I'm going to watch what I drink this evening, is all I have to say. Or ice pick, I guess. Oh, I'm sorry. That's terrible. I can't do that. Anyway, yes. he talks about everyday life as a site of uneven development, right? And he talks about what he calls the colonization of everyday life, returning to Rosa Luxemburg's famous book on accumulation. And these two concepts, uneven development and colonization, I think provide him with a very grounded historical way of making use of this somewhat idealist, spiritual, Lukácsian set of concepts. But this is like, this is a conversation for the seminar room, maybe not the big auditorium. Okay, so we dealt with that. I think there's actually an interesting question involved, though, in your comment about communication and transparency, and Lefebvre on one hand, and Michel Desserteau. And indeed, the everyday, la vie quotidienne, is a huge category in post-war French thought, beginning with Lefebvre and continuing really to the present. And Desserteau occupies a complex position in that trajectory, certainly developing a theme from Lefebvre, but I think transforming it in fundamental ways. And I think one of the interesting things about Desserteau, potentially, is precisely his interest in blindness and in the opacity of everyday life, which is, Lefebvre always remains at some level a good Leninist, right? I mean, Lefebvre is ultimately interested in making everyday life a nice, rational, enlightened, brightly lit, hygienic realm at some essential level, But there are people who read Lefebvre against the grain and take up points that are implicit in his critique of everyday life and push them further. I mean, Maurice Blanchot, of course, in his 1962 article, Everyday Speech, in which he insists on the inability to represent the everyday, the opacity of the everyday as a site of resistance in and of itself. As that, he says, the everyday is that which escapes. That is its definition, right? And I think Desserteau picks up on some of that. Some of that interest in the blindness of the everyday as its most salient quality. I think that's something to think about further. And okay, I'll just leave that at that. And then lastly, we want to talk about rational hatreds. And I haven't thought this through, and so here I can only really offer a very vague and speculative set of comments, maybe. But that is to say, okay, let's take this specific example of someone like Guy Debord, who spent a great deal of his life cutting off people and declaring enmities and hatreds. And this has often been something he's been roundly criticized for, as a kind of holdover of Stalinian purges and authoritarian personalities and the like. And, there's probably some of the authoritarian in Debord. But beyond that, there's a question of an ethics of thought that might be a more interesting or provocative way of thinking of that mode of operating. That his hatreds were never personal hatreds, I don't think, or very seldom were personal hatreds, but were ethical positions taken up. That I need, here I can draw. Our friendship can continue only so far, and here I have to draw a line, and now we're enemies, and that's it. And I think beyond the autobiographical aspect of that in Debord's life, there is a kind of outline of an ethics of thought that might be interesting, and particularly in a moment like our own, governed by a kind of intellectual pluralism, in which we often sit in conferences like these and let 1,000 flowers bloom. There may be something productive in those things, and we may agree with each other too much. And although I wouldn't want to ever have to say like, Cuauhtémoc Medina, I gotta sit, you are part of the gangsters now, that kind of thing. I hope I don't have to do that, Cuauhtémoc. I'm just saying, I would feel very bad. But, I'm just saying I hold it out as, I'm keeping that in reserve just in case. But I should stop. Thank you all. Okay, thanks.